So thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Our session tonight is Understanding Power, Privilege, and Poverty. And our facilitator for this evening is LaWanda Shepard. LaWanda is a Philadelphia native. She resides in Delaware now. We'll forgive her for that. She's currently with Exelon's African American Resource Alliance. And she's also been an active member of the American Association of Black Energy, serves as the chair for Blacks in Energy Awareness Month, and served as a leading advisor with PICO's Explorer program, mentoring high school students while also being a board member of Peace and Love Worldwide in Philadelphia, raising awareness on domestic and senseless violence prevention. And with that, I will turn it over to you, LaWanda.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate the introduction, Janine. Hello, everyone. I am excited to be able to be here and present this workshop with you and just connect with you all, just to have this very meaningful and impactful discussion. You know, Janine, don't hold me. I was born and raised in North Philadelphia, not too far from Temple, so I'm always going to be a Philly girl, always. So, and I bleed green too. Just to give you a little bit more of my background, as I said, I was born and raised in North Philadelphia. I've only been living in Delaware for the past 8 years. But a lot of the work that I do, I still tend to lean towards my Philadelphia community just because that's where my roots were. I'm currently employed with Exelon Corporation in the daytime. I manage our capital asset portfolio, just making sure that people are spending the money where it needs to be spent so that our investors in turn can get a return on those. And what I do part-time, of course, is coaching, and also I do a lot of work around the DEI space when it comes to executive trainings and development. So I am a certified master coach as well. I'm looking forward to this discussion because, you know, it's all about just broadening your horizons and trying to, you know, look at things from a wider view rather than a narrow view. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion. Does anyone have any questions so far? Good. And I definitely welcome anyone's feedback, your participation. You can ask questions throughout. You know, you can feel free to stop me if you want to interrupt, because I want this to be as interactive as possible. Again, thank you for having me, especially when we're on the heels of something that's happened so tragic within your community and the border community. With the officers passing. So my condolences goes out to his work family and his family as well. So thank you. So just to get started here, I'm just going to bring up my presentation and just want to make sure that you guys can let me know when you can see it. Sorry.
Yep, we can see it.
Do you see something with the orange screen or burgundy?
We are seeing your AHA slide, your AHA screen. I don't know if that's what you want us to see yet. All right.
It looks like someone is in a waiting room too.
Yeah.
All right. Can you see the one that says Understanding Power and Privilege?
Yeah, we're seeing it.
All right, great. So yeah, today our topic is understanding power, privilege, and poverty. And just so that I can get an understanding of where everyone you know, is on this subject, if they have any experience or any thoughts, I did think to put together a quick, I did think just to put together a quick I'm sorry, I'm trying to toggle here. A quick,
I'll paste the link for you, Sophia.
thank you. I'm just trying to move my screen. All right, just for you guys to be able to just give me your input on what you think power, privilege, and poverty means on who has power and privilege, and if it's possible for people who are impoverished to have power and privilege as well. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so if you guys can go to ahaslides.com and type in the code. And these are all letters, OQAMA. And there's also a QR code. If you want, I can show that if that would be easier for you guys. And you guys can, I'll give you a minute or so just to get there. Is everyone set to go?
Yeah, I get that the participant limit exceeded.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the
Really?
question that's there, is that a question you want us on?
Yes, it should be what, oh wait, I'm sorry. Okay, you know what?
No, yeah, I think
We're
it's the
just
other
not
question.
going to
you
use this. I'll go back. So just to ask a question here, I just want to get some thoughts from you all. What do you think the definition of power is? Anybody? You could come off mute. Come on, somebody.
There's some stuff coming up in the chat.
Having influence over others.
That's a great, that's exactly what it is. Power, control, the amount of autonomy someone has in their decisions. Okay. Control over others and resources, right? Okay. Yeah, so that's exactly what power is. Now, can you also let me know, what do you think is privilege? What does privilege mean? Have an advantage? That's good.
I think it's kind of being shielded from everything else. Being at apart.
Because you don't have to, right? You're
Right.
shielded because you don't
Right.
have to.
Right, because
Yep.
it doesn't affect you.
It doesn't affect you, right? All right, benefits that others may not have, and using your power at the expense of someone who doesn't have it, or being entitled. That's a great one. Being entitled, that's a great one. Yep. And what would you guys say are some negative impacts of power and privilege in society? I'm monitoring the chat. Repression. Different outcomes. That's broad. Can you elaborate on the different outcomes, Shayna?
Yeah, I just meant like the same people doing the same thing, or by going the same road might have different outcomes because of privilege or power that others don't have.
Yep. Which can be either, you could kind of be into the haves or the have-nots, so to speak, or in between if you are, like middle-class people are. Yep. And then also I see Pat, people who see any kind of changes as a zero sum. If others gain, I lose. Yes, that is, yep, that's a big one. Also, Deborah says influence, support, control, power, privilege equals benefits, to some signifier, could be earned or granted, power in society, politics, money, education, race. Yep, that's good. Some people think that power is only limited to a certain thing, as is politics or money, but it does trickle down to much more than that: money, education, race, classism. So those are good points. And lack of access. Yep. So also I had just to throw out there some of the topics that I came up with as well that is impacted, and it could be education inequality, which someone says, racial discrimination, classism, financial and land and food resources, right? Like, if people may not hold certain authority, they may have limited access to all of those things. Even sustainability, to be able to maintain yourself or your family, those things are at risk. Dominating people, I thought would be good to put on here as well. And another big one, which we've been seeing, is social injustice. Like, why are these injustices happening? Why aren't we doing more as a people about it, beyond just protests and things like that? Why isn't there applicable legislation or laws that will help to alleviate that social injustice? And that's a lot has to do with who's in power and who impacts it, and which leads us to the political influence. And then ultimately it impacts generational wealth, right? Like, if we don't have the access that we need to education and those types of things, then people can be left behind, and that just broadens the gap of the wealth gap. And may I ask a question as well? Let me see. One, sorry. The positive aspects of power and privilege have been so badly skewed that they're becoming nothing but negative words. Can you explain that, Deborah, if you don't mind?
I think power, like, in a great sense of the word, it's like you have this ability, to do anything. And like, what seems to be happening is that people are using that power to do whatever suits them,
Yeah.
which oftentimes does not suit the majority of everyone else.
Yeah.
And then when you add in race and ethnicity and gender and just all sorts of other things that we all are, right? It's just becoming such a negative thing to be somebody in power, right? That must mean you're crooked, when it doesn't have to be. And then privilege, like it used to be, you cleaned your room and your parents gave you the privileges of, having, I don't know, getting to go to the park, or, you know what I mean? Like, you did something and you earned a privilege. And now it's just, you're just birthed, and you either don't or do have privilege. And they're both just so negative now because there's too many abuses of those two entities, like those two aspects of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As a participant, this is me as a participant, as a Temple alumni myself, I really want to echo what Deborah shared here, right? That, and if we think of, I think somebody mentioned the definition earlier on of power. I definitely agree with Deborah here that if power is just a matter of influence, then that influence could be to move folks in very positive directions or move them in directions that negatively impact individuals, communities, and groups. So I really heard what Deborah is saying here in terms of how it has taken on this very overt negative connotation that when we hear it now, we immediately think of something along the lines of race, right? Something along the lines of somebody being deprived, of somebody being taken advantage of, which is disheartening. Agreed. So thanks, Deborah, for raising that.
Those are actually great points, and I appreciate you for sharing them, which is really to your point, Deborah, the reason why this conversation is needed to be had, because many oftentimes we're not paying attention to the impact that these things have on society, right? And even more so, it's kind of like you're either on this side or that side of the spectrum when it comes into, power and privilege. To your point, like your parent is the person that's in power over you, or was, as a child. And like you said, now when you think of power, you're not thinking about your parents, you're thinking about a politician or the president or something like that. But just to bring it back into our individual skews of what we think power and privilege in society is. And can everyone, okay, so I just wanted to make sure that you guys could see my screen, but Nicole says she's fine. Okay, cool. Can anyone tell me how might power and privilege and poverty impact your role in TUAA, or how it might impact the work of, the Temple alumni? And we can come back to that question if you want. Everyone on the call does something different, right? In a different role.
Yeah, I think it can skew the way that we look at the university. It can skew the way that we handle programming and volunteers and, pretty much everything skewed sort of in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we look at like there's this perception, Temple, if we speaking very bluntly, Temple being in North Philadelphia, it's seen as a university in the center of a poverty-stricken space, right? So when you think of Temple, you may think of it from a certain impoverished lens, right? In terms of the population of Temple, the folks who pass through Temple, the majority of possibly the students at Temple, and this is not necessarily factual, but just how we might think about it because of where Temple is situated. And even as we think about it even further, when we thought of the incident that happened on Saturday, I am pretty certain many of us had images in our minds of perpetrator and victim before we saw images. Is that a fair statement to me? And that, I think, because of how we locate Temple and the place in which we locate Temple, that is one of the challenges of how we start looking at power and privilege and the programs, as Janine said, right? The programs and the messaging and stuff like that we put out about the university, or people who are in and around the university. So yeah, and TUA is right at the heart of that, right? This is the point of contact for those who spend 4 years here and then leave, 4, 5, or 6 years here and then leave. So it's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kaiser, and to your point about Temple, right, being in North Philadelphia, and just for me, being a past resident of North Philly, right, it's always been looked at as Temple being that higher power, and because they have such prestige, it's like nothing's going to happen there in Temple. Like they're lit. They own the whole Broad Street, so to speak, in North Philadelphia, right? And you guys have your own police. So it's like you felt safe, being in the Temple area, just as a student, or even if you're a resident, you felt like because I'm surrounded by Temple, there's so much, Temple has such a heavy, weight around that area that no one would get hurt, that you would be safe. And it's unfortunate that more and more, students are being attacked. And then, the first time you guys lost an officer, you know, who was there protecting, so to see this happen, it's like, wait a minute now, who's really in power here? And I just, go ahead.
No, Sophia, something, I'm looking at something Pat said, right? That, and I think this is in relation to the question of how it impacts, right? That volunteerism, volunteering assumes that you have time and space, which not everyone may feel like they have. That's a real thing there, right? That because this is volunteer run, yeah? And if we are talking about poverty and privilege and we're looking at the two, then the ones who may have the time to dedicate to volunteer, not saying that, and I want to be very clear, right? Not saying that people who are impoverished don't volunteer their time, because in many cases they volunteer their time a lot, right? But a certain type and a certain type of volunteering, right, that they may not have the resources in this moment, right? Or the bandwidth is the word I was looking for, to do a certain level of volunteering in this moment, that if they're not volunteering or the space isn't created for them to volunteer simply because of resource distribution, then the programming that is coming out may not represent them, right? It may not represent their interests and stuff like that. So, so just taking what Pat is saying here, and looking at how that can have a trickle impact on it, really resonated with me in this moment.
Absolutely. And really, as it's up to you all, Temple alumni and employees and such, right, to be, cognizant of what your role and your position is as individuals and as a collective, because you guys do, because you are connected to Temple, you guys do have, authority and power in a sense over those types of things that get decided, the students that are attracted there, what it is that, the alumni offers the students and those types of things. So, and I'm reading Luke's comment too. Events and connections heavily favored towards schools, colleges, and demographics that are already overrepresented.
There seems to be a question from Gail, it looks like.
Yes, and thank you. I want to say Temple is not absolutely unique. It's doesn't matter what city or town you're in, with universities at the size or in the purpose of a Temple. I think the other thing in this is that the other stakeholders that also have power over Temple, or education institutions. It's not clear to me that education is something that is a priority for the society. And even though you say Temple has power, their power is being skewed by the fact that if something's not valued, then other people are making Temple do things or involve themselves with Temple, but not really deal with education. I find it and it's not just, whether it's HBCUs or state schools or Ivy League schools, do we want education institutions to really have value in the community? Because if you have value in the community, then you'll be thinking, oh, well, if I've got to build 10 more dorms, and that's going to, disrupt, maybe 2 or 3 street row houses, then I also need to find where I'm going to displace these people who are in those row houses, because these people eventually want to be part of my infrastructure at Temple, whether they are workers, whether they are students. There shouldn't be this, zero-sum games that, it's them versus us.
Yeah.
And, we haven't really made it, relevant whether we want education to be something as a necessity for society to grow, like we want healthcare, like we want jobs or things like that. There's a reason why you're seeing campuses, Michigan, people just don't have no respect for that institution, no matter what. People go up there and they kill and shoot people randomly. Little children in elementary school, you're shooting, kids. And I'm like, if you value that that the purpose of that institution, or that institution did deliver on that, you know, I think we would have a much better integration of the community as well as that institution. I mean, do you know what I mean? I mean, it makes sense. I mean, because to me, the business model for education is not only that you're teaching and you're having research and all like that, but you're growing your society. The more education there is in society, the grander your society builds, and the power and the privilege is more equally spread out without people feeling like they've lost something. Because, you know, you really don't lose anything by including more than less people. If you include more people, you grow more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it. I'm sorry to keep going talking. Bye-bye.
No, this is what we're supposed to do, have a conversation about it, Gail. And you bring about a good point, and I did touch on it in further on in this presentation, is that, you know, education is the great leveler, right? And it's even some debate right now as to if it really is the great leveler, you know. And you know, I'm on the side that it is. Now, does it have to be through the institution of higher learning and college and all that stuff? Then maybe that's debatable. But when you talk about furthering your education beyond what we're talking secondary school, post, you know, secondary education, then yeah, we need more than just that. And it your point brought me to a thought, because I never really connected this until we're having this discussion now. When I was younger, I was a teen mom, and I went to Temple had a program for teenage parents. And I don't know if any of you remember, but it used to be like a school that they had for high school, for high schoolers, where if you were pregnant, your school, your regular high school would send you to this program, and you would go to school there during the day and until you delivered your child, and then you would return back to your home school. And I don't know that, and they cut that program out a couple years after I had my child. My son is 27 now, but so that was, you know, wow, I just thought about that. Wow. That was, my son is 27, but I was bringing that up to say that it was those kinds of programs that actually helped me, because who's to say if Temple didn't have that program, would I have even finished high school?
Absolutely.
I was in 10th grade.
I know about that program. There's others like you that, you know, I know that went through that, and it really, it has more value to Temple to have done that than you probably ever thought about, because it took away the stigma of teenage moms, okay? Because you were worthy enough to be getting education, getting exposure. You're not far from a hospital. You know, residents have got, you know, some more experience with dealing with people with different pregnancy issues. It's always more. It's always better when you include more than when you do less. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a full suite. You know, we were offered those resources. So if we can continue to put those types of programs back into the community, then I believe that, you know, we can continue to build trust and be able to move beyond moving people out of poverty, and, you know, giving people more power, so to speak. So
I think it has to be a collection, my dear, between the political stakeholder, the education stakeholders, the employer stakeholders, and you have to allow for variety. Everybody doesn't teach the same or learn the same, so everybody has to. But the goal is to bring in as more in than to push out.
Mm-hmm.
You know. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you had a good time at that program. I know a lot of people. I mean, executive women. It really helped a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. So yeah, so just then moving on to, you know, further the discussion is that, you know, wealth distribution in America. So there's a direct correlation between the large disparity or gap between power and privilege and poverty, right? So like according to, the Fed, they're saying that the average Black and Hispanic or Latino households, they earn about as half as the average white household, and own only about 15 to 20% of net wealth. And that was just in 2021. So we're showing, what studies are showing is that the gap is only getting bigger, and we're getting further away from the point, right, of closing the payroll gap between race and gender, actually. I know we didn't include gender here, but Deborah, did you have a comment? Okay, no, sorry, I thought you were getting ready to come off. Okay. So, and they're saying that many experts, they attribute the country's legacy of slavery and racist economic policies is due to, it's the highest gap that any developed country has. And, when you think of America and how progressive we are, how inclusive we are, supposedly we have so much power and authority, but yet within our own country, our own ranks, we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to closing the gap. And it's important for us to recognize this, because it also leads into privilege. Being an American, we have these privileges, even though it's not for every citizen, every American citizen, it should be. And the onus is on us to do what we can in our positions to lessen the privileges. To lessen the gap. So right here, what this is saying is that this chart is saying that 50% of earners only own 3.3% of the total wealth. So basically here, the rich is getting richer, the poor is getting poorer. The 1% is becoming so elite, they're gonna be like less than 1% at some point. But if you can see on this chart, as far as the percentages go, we're on the bottom, and that's only 3.3%, which is really devastating. I don't know how you all feel about it. I'm a part of the 99%, and that's just not fair. Is anyone familiar with the term, the wallet has the vote? What do you think that means, Deborah?
Well, I think the obvious is, right, you hear about how much money is spent on ads and these political campaigns. And, I guess to a certain degree that money is going to somebody who's making the bumper stickers, which might be some of those 50% people, right? But it's all bought, because in the end, it's all of the wealthiest people in the world, somehow funnel their money into making sure that the person that follows their agenda, in not just in the United States, but in other countries too, get to be in power, so that it's like all the little kings and queens of the world just want to stay together. And I just feel like, does anybody really need $420 billion? Like, really? I don't know. Like, I think maybe I'm too, I know. I mean, I just think like, gosh, what I would do with $420 million, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Like, yeah, we'd have to spend more money on food, but everybody would have enough. It just blows my mind about how powerful we could be. I'm sorry, I'm on my soapbox here, but how powerful we could be if everybody was brought up. Nobody, you don't have to be equal, but because nobody's ever equal, right? Like, I'm not equal to anybody here, nor is anybody else, right? Like, because we all have our differences. But like, if we were just all given the same opportunities, like that's all you need.
Yep. Does anyone else care to weigh in? I know Kaiser, you said you just saw a post where Pastor paid himself an annual salary of $54 million. I'm telling you, what country was that in?
That's here. And it's somebody we know. I'm not going to say the name. I don't want to start that conversation.
Oh
Not
gosh.
personally, not know personally, right? I think if you know this person personally, you may not be in this conversation right now. But it's somebody who it's the on networks and stuff like that. But that's 54 million a year salary, right? That's
Yeah.
from profit. So what the organization is making on top of that is even more significant. So
Wow.
it's a different conversation.
I'm still like,
Your wealth is, the wealth formula has a different kind of algorithm than it had, 40, 50 years ago. And, as we got into the 90s, all your TV shows was about money. Oprah, Survivor, the Apprentice. Everybody wanted to know how much you were making. I mean, that became the talk. And so tax reform and other things started to be built into that conversation. And that's how this we've got this big divide about how people are making money in a certain way that they're able to get it, and even how companies are ranked and how they're measured is daily time of how often the stock goes up, not how good the product is. So that's what's fueling it. I mean, you've got people coming out of college or not even finishing college at 19 or 20 years old and getting paid 20 to 80 million or 100 and something $1 million, and they haven't even won a championship. So it's crossing a lot of different areas, and it's just mind-boggling that people who will never get even that much money like the idea that other people can get that much money at their expense.
Yeah. Yep. And that brings us to our point, Gal. Thank you for making it. Is the things and listed here are what are the main drivers of this gap. And of course, the leading one is corporate and individual tax breaks, and we always hear about this every campaign. This is always such a big topic about how much of a tax break a corporation's getting, and individual tax break that business people are getting, versus regular people who don't have a business or own corporations, the people who go to work and make money off of their paycheck. We're paying more taxes than them essentially. And then also too, what was introduced is cheap labor, right? You can take your labor from the United States and go over to a third world country and pay, just increments of what you would pay an American citizen to work. And these are the advantages that has allowed for the wealthy to become wealthier, right? And then also because of that, the wealthy, they have policies, they're able to, what do they call it? Lobbyists. They're able to lobby and buy, so to speak, buy their way into policy and lawmaking, just to make policies that will protect them and their businesses. So these are the things that contribute to the gap. And in order to reduce it, here are a few ways, of course, and you spoke about this, Gail, which is expanded educational opportunities. Should student loan debt cancellation, should that even be an argument? When we talk about wanting to get people ahead, we should want to make education easier to be assessed. Also, we could create government funded trade programs. There's a lot of discussion on trade versus higher education, college education. Well, let's give everybody the option. Also incentivize businesses to recruit more diverse candidates, you know, people who are maybe Black or people of color, people who have a minority tag. Let's do more to bring them into the fold of where they can begin to create generational wealth within themselves. Also pointed out here is, you know, progressive income tax guidelines. The more you make, the more taxes you pay. And likewise, the less you make, the less taxes you pay. So instead of it being, you know, the tax code being written strictly for people who own businesses and can hide behind S corporations, how about you really help the people who actually pay into the tax system? I don't know about, oh, go ahead, Nicole.
So as I'm listening, and then when the slide came up, and I agree that these are fantastic options and things that can be done. And just thinking about canceling student loan debt and how President Biden attempted to do that in a certain way. For me, I kind of go back to education and knowing that you have to understand how the world operates to be able to change it. And it's hard as, you know, when you're adult working and then you realize, okay, I'm at the voting age and I'm going to start voting. And it's like, what does voting really mean? And I think in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot more like grassroots efforts, and especially when there was voting disparities going on during COVID, and just how important even local governments are. And I think all of these recommendations are fantastic, but at the same time, it's just important for people to remember education. I say that from the perspective that I'm a Fox School of Business graduate, but I went to a private school for high school. And the type of students that I went to school with were, their parents were CEO of JP Morgan Chase and CEO of this luxury brand and things of that nature. And what you realize is, one, it's the wealth transfer from generation to generation. But two, a lot of it, when even you talk about the tax code, their parents and their families know the codes backwards and forwards, or they pay somebody who tells them exactly what to do. And I am first generation born in America. And so what that taught me, my experience was that you don't know what you don't know. And as I've gotten older, and then you talk to more people and you realize, oh, so that's what your parents do. When you were born, when you're a certain age, you can list a child on your LLC and get a tax, I don't want to get too technical, but there's savings that you can do with your kids when you have them as somebody who works for you and you pay them, and technically then you're saving money, but then you're also paying your child. Like, there's so many laws and rules in like the tax system that it is hard to understand, but it just brings me back to the point of education. And so even what voting truly means, most people think voting for the president is the most important thing that you can do, when actually it's your local representatives that are even more important. Understanding how the government works so that you can get in, and if you want to become a lobbyist to lobby for the right things.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this is about educating as much as you can. Educate yourself, educate your children, because really that's the way that we're going to be able to get all of these recommendations to come to fruition. When more people are aware, more people are fighting the fight for disparity.
Yeah, Nicole, thank you for sharing that. And that just brings about the point where we were saying about education being the great leveler. It can, and if we revise, to your point, what are we teaching kids in school? What are we teaching? We need to take a look at that. What is being taught now? Is it relevant to what's happening now, and to keep our society moving forward? I'm on the opinion that education is the great leveler, depending on what you learn and how you learn it, for sure. But if it's going to help you get a better footing in the economy for your family and sustain yourself, then absolutely. So, yep. just to move on to the next slide. So again, these are ways to create wealth and income equality, right? You know, increase in minimum wage. That was a very big topic of discussion pre-COVID. Then we went through COVID and we found out that businesses, not only could they afford to pay more than minimum wage, they did it with less employees, you know, or less resources, even though they were, businesses were shut down and things like that, people were staying home, and they increased the minimum wage and was operating on less. So, you know, again, should these things have been a topic? You know, we want to look at the things that we as individuals support, as well as using your power, your full amount of power that you have as an individual with any organizations that you're connected to, you know, which is, you know, respectively TUAA. You want to use this to take a look at these things, you know, to try to make not only your life better, but the people that, you know, will come behind us. So just looking at this list, are there any other things that speak out to you, anyone, or suggestions on how to create equality amongst wealth? I know one for me that jumped out here was a couple actually, building assets for working families, meaning, you know, we have proper access to fair, low-cost financial services, home ownership. So like Nicole spoke about, you know, learning about credit, learning about the things that we need to do to get, learning about business, how we can create a business, how we can run a business. You know, investing in your education, whatever that is. Establishing more of a Head Start preschool programs. We need to really spend money there because it starts when they're in the womb, essentially, you know. We need to be teaching and supporting and being a resource for the children that are being born. Another one is this ending residential segregation. Does anyone know what that means, residential segregation?
Like redlining?
Basically. I don't know if anyone is familiar. I think this week, the Currys have been put in the hot seat, Steph Curry, Aisha Curry, because they had some townhomes that were slated to be built in their area, in their neighborhood, and they opposed it because their property is worth over 30 million, and they didn't want any townhomes built, just so, you know, to them, it would bring their property down. Has anyone heard about this?
No, but it's the same thing that your Silicon CEOs did in the late 90s and the early 2000s. They just happened to not have a conversation that Steph Curry, they just bought them out. And they, you know, they didn't have to worry about the townhomes and the row houses anymore. They you know, had enough money, those CEOs, to sit there and it's not, you know, it's even beyond eminent domain. They just went ahead and gave everybody a decent payout. You know, they didn't gyp them and give them only $3,000. They gave them some significant dollars. Okay. You know, so I understand racial segregation in residential properties and things like that. You know, so it still goes on, still happens.
Yeah, and they tried, and I know we only have a few minutes left, but they tried to basically insinuate that it was going to be low income housing, but anyone who wants to live in your neighborhood, you have a $30 million house, I'm sure that your neighbors aren't going to be low income, you know? But it's those types of things, you know, when we become successful in life, not are we separating ourselves from the rest and putting ourselves in a place where we're you know, in our minds above others, or are we a part of the total of the total community? Are we not putting that dividing line in? You know, and those are things that we have to be cognizant of, not, you know, closing ourselves off of what the rest of society is doing.
Janine,
Being
thank
out
you
of
for
touch.
sharing the link. Thank you for sharing the link, Janine, to redlining. You know, one piece of there's one thing that I do want to share here as we are wrapping this piece up. I don't know how many of you have heard of it started off with the 57 Blocks Initiative and now has expanded to the 72 Blocks Initiative here in Philadelphia. And just outside of the Temple area, some of those blocks are right outside of the Temple Patrol area, right outside of the campus area. And what this initiative is that they looked at these 57 blocks in Philadelphia, where it has the highest level of criminal activity or crime, right? And what they realize is that these 57 blocks, as I said, now expand to 72 blocks, these 57 blocks, when you map it onto historical maps of disinvestment, those blocks have been the blocks that have been the most heavily disinvested from over the past few decades. So it really mapped on a clear correlation between how crime has enveloped these areas and what disinvestment of resources, redlining and stuff has done to these areas in particular. So it's very, so you can detangle or separate the impact of what we are seeing now from these concepts that Gail, Deborah, and so many others have touched on, Nicole have touched on today in so many different ways. So definitely, there's just touching on some of these subjects, and there's a lot more to get into behind it. And thanks again, Janine, for sharing that link on Redline. Just reminded me to share that tidbit there of something that we are looking at right now.
Yeah, and Kaiser, that's a great point. And I don't know if anyone has any other questions before we close out, but I definitely want to offer, you know, as we wrap up today's session, is that we begin to think about all of these things that's happening in the world around us and the things that are driving poverty. And we know that, you know, poverty definitely breeds desperation. It definitely breeds low values and morale. And people will act in a way that they wouldn't normally act if they were impoverished. So, you know, for us, the point would be here is for us to take a look at those things that really drive the causes, the root causes, and also think about and act on what we can do as individuals to set about change. Are there any questions?
Have you ever thought to also include international statistics and facts about how they have developed some of their society and their classes, like Scandinavian countries, you know, or even some infrastructures over there in Germany or Australia, you know, just to
Expand it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good idea. Yeah, that's a definitely good idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because some countries, they don't even have like tax codes, or they don't have credit assessment, credit scores, and those type of things that, you know, people in poverty, you know, people who are in poverty, it's more expensive for them to live, unfortunately, because they don't have enough of. If they have bad credit, then they get charged more. You know, if you don't have enough money, you have to shop at a supermarket who can't provide the necessary healthy foods and those types of things too. So I know we're just at 8 o'clock. It's a great conversation, and I hope that this gets you all to thinking about what impact you can make as individuals as well as with your organization.
Thank you
for your time today.